Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for tonight's OPT review session. My name is Zaina Karabatic, and I'm one of the assistant directors within the Office of International Student and Scholar Affairs. I'm joined today by my colleague, Leah Zimmer, who is going to be co-presenting this presentation with me. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, wonderful. So we are going to be talking about F1 optional practical training. So if you're here for the review session or the overview of OPT, you're in the right place. So what are some of the things that we hope to accomplish in today's session? Some questions that we hope to answer. What is OPT? What is your status while on OPT? What is the expected timeline, the application process for applying for this employment authorization benefit? What does that look like in terms of getting your new I-20 and formally applying to USCIS? What does it mean to be authorized for work in the United States, and who provides that authorization to you? What are your responsibilities while on F1 OPT, and how are these responsibilities different than what you were doing during your academic program at Notre Dame? I do also want to mention that there is a chat feature. If you have any questions that come up throughout the presentation, feel free to put them there, and we will be answering them both throughout the presentation and then predominantly towards the end. I do ask that the questions be relevant to the information that we're presenting on. If you have a question, note that it may get answered throughout the presentation, but do rest assured that we will stick around as long as needed at the end to answer any residual questions that come up. All right, so what is OPT? So OPT stands for Optional Practical Training. It is a benefit of the F1 student status, and it allows students in F1 status to engage in either paid or unpaid off-campus employment that's related to their major field of study, the degree that they receive at the University of Notre Dame. So a few notes about OPT. In order to be eligible to apply for the OPT benefit, you must have been enrolled on your current CVIS ID for at least one consecutive academic year. And when we say academic year, we mean a fall and a spring semester, or a spring and a fall semester. If you have any questions about this specifically for you, then it may be best to make an appointment with us to ask us about your particular situation. You are eligible for 12 months of OPT per degree level, plus an additional 24 months if you're in a STEM eligible field. I will note that we are not going to go into too much depth about the STEM OPT extension, but we will reference it in this presentation in case that's applicable to some of you. Note that the 12 months of OPT per degree level is relevant going up, which means that if you previously did an undergraduate degree in the United States and you received OPT for your undergraduate degree, then you would be eligible for another 12 months of OPT at the graduate level. So if you're pursuing a master's at Notre Dame, then you'd be eligible for another 12 months of OPT for the master's level. However, if you previously pursued a master's degree in the US and you already accessed OPT at the master's level, do keep in mind that you will not be eligible for another 12 months of OPT if you complete another master's. So it is per degree level moving upwards. Any employment that you pursue while under your F1 OPT does have to be directly related to your major. If you have two majors, it can be related to either one, but it does have to be related to your major field of study. And we're going to get into a little bit more detail about that throughout the presentation. Is a job offer required to apply for OPT? This is a common question that we get, and the answer is no. You do not have to have a job in order to apply for OPT. So if you're planning to apply and you have a job lined up, that's great. If you don't have a job lined up, that's perfectly fine as well, not to worry. However, your employment authorization period does have to start within the 60 days following your program end date or your program completion date. And it is limited to 12 months, which means that there is a finite amount of time in order for you to be able to find employment and start working on your OPT in order to continue maintaining your F1 status while on OPT. So during that 12-month period, students are allowed up to 90 days of unemployment. So the 90 days of unemployment are built into that 12 months. So during the 12 months of OPT, you can be unemployed for 90 of those days, or roughly 3 out of those 12 months. And we're going to get again into more detail about what the timeline might look like throughout the presentation. And a lot of this information is going to be repeated and reiterated in many different ways. So hopefully it will be clear as we move through the presentation tonight. So who grants OPT? Who authorizes it? So U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, is the ultimate government entity that authorizes you for optional practical training. However, ISSA is involved in this process, and we do advise you on the application process from start to finish. One thing that you will need in order to submit your application for OPT is a recommendation from the ISSA office. This recommendation comes in the form of a new I-20. So when you apply for OPT, the very first step, and we will repeat this later on, but the very first step is to request an updated I-20 from ISSA. And we're going to go over what that looks like and how to do it and what that process entails. But you will need that OPT I-20 in order to formally apply to USCIS and submit your entire OPT application. When should you apply? So F1 students cannot apply more than 90 days before the program end date on their I-20. And when we say program end date, what we're referring to is that program completion date, or the day by which all of your program requirements will be completed. And so again, we're going to touch base on this in a little bit more detail. But for some of you, your program end date on your I-20 right now may not necessarily line up with what your completion date is going to be, specifically referencing those of you who may be graduating early, and that will be fixed by the time you apply for OPT. It is built into the process. So again, I'll reference that again in a little bit. So what should you know about the application process? So students have to choose an authorization start date within 60 days of the program end date, which means that for the majority of you who will be completing your programs on May 21st of 2023, or the end date of the spring 2023 semester at Notre Dame, per the academic calendar, the earliest start date that you could request would be the day after, which would be May 22nd. And the latest possible start date you can request would be July 20th, which is the 60th day after that May 21st completion date. So you get to choose what start date makes the most sense for you. And this may depend on whether you have a job lined up. The vast majority of students who don't have a job lined up will likely choose the latest possible start date to maximize the amount of time they have to find a job on OPT. But so ultimately you will choose this start date, and it does have to be one day in the 60 days following your program completion. The USCIS processing time averages about 2 to 5 months. We have recently seen processing times be fairly low. We've seen students getting approved in about 1.5 to 2 months. And while ISSA cannot guarantee a particular processing time, this has made us optimistic that hopefully the processing times will continue to stay low for this cohort applying in 2023. So I'd say on average, we would tell you to expect around a 2-month processing time, and then be pleasantly surprised if it gets processed any sooner than that. So as part of this application to USCIS, they do have a fee that you will need to pay before you're able to formally submit the application. This fee is a $410 fee that is paid, again, to USCIS. This is not an ISSA fee. This is something you're going to do as part of your online application when you file for OPT. It will be the last step in the process before being able to submit that online application. So what kind of employment is allowed during OPT? So as you're looking for jobs, what are the kinds of employment that you may be searching for? So one of the great things about post-completion OPT, these first 12 months, is that the kind of employment you can pursue is actually quite flexible. However, it is important to note that no matter what kind of employment you pursue, all of the work that you do while on your first 12 months of OPT must be directly related to your program of study. Also, it can be said your major field of study. So any work you do, you must be able to tie it back to the major that you studied at Notre Dame in your program. The kinds of employment can include things like regular paid employment, like a salary position, a 9-to-5 position. That's totally permissible. It can be payment by short-term employers or multiple short-term employers, things like gig work, if that's relevant to the kind of work that you might be doing in your program. And note that we do say multiple. It is permissible to have more than one employer while on OPT. This can be multiple employers at the same time, or it can be multiple employers throughout your 12 months of OPT. You are allowed to stop and then start a new position if that is relevant for you in your situation. Things like independent contracting positions would be acceptable. Something like self-employment, if you plan to start a company, you want to get a business license and you want to work for your own company, something like that would be allowed during the first 12 months of OPT. I should note that if you're eligible for the STEM OPT extension, that these kinds of employment are not necessarily all allowed on the STEM OPT extension. So just a note that if you are planning to apply for STEM OPT, it may be helpful to note that while this kind of employment is allowed on post OPT, the requirements for STEM OPT may be a little bit more strict. So just something to keep in mind. Employment through some kind of employment or staffing agency, or potentially volunteer or unpaid internships. Note that we say unpaid internships where no labor laws are violated. So while you do not necessarily have to be paid in the work that you do on OPT, if somebody else were doing the job, say a US citizen, a domestic worker, and they were getting paid, then you as an international student should also be getting paid. It's not sufficient to just not accept money for a position that would otherwise be a paid position. And so those labor laws are there to protect you as a worker in the US. So just keep that in mind. And if you have particular questions about a specific kind of employment or a specific opportunity, feel free to touch base with ISSA, and we're happy to go over that with you. It's important to note that USCIS considers more than 20 hours per week as full-time, regardless of whether the position is paid. It is also important to note that you are expected to average around 20 hours per week in order to continue maintaining your status while on OPT. And so this can be at least 20 hours per week with one employer. If you have multiple employers, in total, you should be working at least 20 hours a week in order to maintain your F1 status on OPT. So just a note about remote work on OPT, because questions around remote work have, of course, become really prevalent since the COVID-19 pandemic. So current policy around remote work on OPT, it allows students to engage in remote work even while they're abroad or outside of the US, as long as their employer can monitor and assess their work electronically. So in short, you are able to work remotely while on OPT, but you do have to have an employer that is US based and has a US address on file. Anytime that you have employment on OPT, you are going to be required to report it. And we're going to get into the details of what it means to report OPT employment a little bit later. But in order to report this employment, you are going to have your employer's US address. So just to emphasize that any employment that you have on OPT does have to be US based, and you'll have to provide that US address at the time that you report it. When reporting the company's US address, you will have to indicate that what your remote work site is, so where exactly you're working from. So again, just in short, that you are allowed to work remotely, but you will still be subject to certain requirements. Again, your employer has to be US based, and they'll have to be able to monitor your work electronically. We do want to note that this current policy is only applicable through this academic year per USCIS. And so per SEVP, which is another entity of the US government. And so they are hopefully going to update us this summer to let us know if there are any changes to this policy. And of course, as soon as we have that information, we'll be sure to share it with all of you. So We referenced the I-20 program end date and what exactly this means. So for our undergraduate students and most of our master's students, particularly those who don't have a thesis or dissertation requirement, this program end date is going to be May 21st, 2023. That is the posted end date of the spring 2023 semester on Notre Dame's academic calendar. So many of you, probably the majority of you, will have this May 21st date as a completion date if you're planning to complete this spring semester. For those of you who are graduate students that have a thesis or dissertation requirement, primarily we're talking about our doctoral students here, this completion date, this program end date, may vary from this May 21st date. It's likely going to be related more to your dissertation defense date, or maybe the day that you submit your final dissertation, or potentially the last day of your TA responsibilities. There is a little bit more flexibility in what this completion date will look like for you. And so ultimately, ISSA is going to use the completion date that you and your advisor in your program agree upon. We are not going to require this May 21st date. You are going to have to indicate to us at the time that you apply for the OPT I-20 what your completion date is. There's a drop-down menu giving you these options, and you'll have to tell us which one is most appropriate for you. You may also take into account things like, when is the last day that you're going to be expected to participate in your on-campus job or your research with your advisor, and then also considering when your employment might be, if you have employment lined up. So anyway, that's all to say that for our doctoral students primarily, this completion date may be a little bit different than the end of the semester, and that's okay. So just to note that USCIS is more concerned with the date the degree requirements are completed rather than the administrative graduation date. It doesn't necessarily mean when we say completion date, the day that you're walking with your cap and gown during graduation. It's more important, what is the date that those degree requirements are being met? And so it may not necessarily line up exactly with what the actual graduation date is, and that's okay. So F1 students absolutely cannot continue working on campus, things like working in a lab, doing research with a professor, or having any sort of on-campus employment, which you are authorized to do while you're in your program as an F1 student. That authorization will end as of the program completion date. So after the program end date, unless you have been approved for OPT and you have your EAD card in hand, the authorization, and once you're within your authorization period of OPT, note that you will not be able to continue working on campus. So you are able to work on campus once you're approved for OPT. That's okay. But after that program end date, and before you are within your OPT authorization period, you don't have work authorization. And so you will not be able to kind of continue working in an on-campus position during that time period. So just keep in mind that there may be a gap in your ability to be employed. Particularly for our PhD students, this is going to be really important for you to understand, since maybe you have certain research responsibilities with your advisor, or potentially you're working in a lab. Just something to keep in mind when you're thinking of how that program end date is going to impact your ability to keep working until you are approved for your post-completion OPT. So moving on to questions around travel and OPT. So travel before your program end date, so while you're still in your academic program, and travel with your EAD card after you receive it in the mail, after you've been approved for OPT, carry the same risks associated with travel as when you're enrolled as an F1 student. So what we mean by this is that really your ability to travel internationally while you're still in your program, even after you've applied for OPT. So basically from February 20th through May 21st, 2023, you're not going to have any impact in your ability to travel internationally, even with a pending OPT application. Additionally, when you get approved for OPT and you have that EAD card in hand, you are, again, as long as you have that EAD card and you can carry it with you, you're going to be able to travel internationally. The particular situation that we want to focus on, where we would not advise traveling with a pending OPT application, is during the time period after your program completion date. So again, for most of you, this will be after May 21st, 2023, and before you've received your EAD card. So if after May 21st, 2023, or whenever your completion date is, if you, for some reason, have still not received your EAD card, we would not advise traveling internationally. So again, it is probably only going to impact some of you. This will not impact all of you, but it's really, we want to make sure at the time that you're traveling back into the US that you have sufficient documentation to return to the US. And so while you're still in your academic program, you still have something to return to. You still have classes to finish, degree requirements to complete. And then once you're on OPT or you've been approved for OPT, you have your EAD card to prove that you have your OPT and your employment to return to. But in the meantime, after your program end date and before you get your EAD card, you're in a little bit of a limbo where you don't really have necessarily something to return to in the United States. And so travel outside the US, it's just that there's an elevated risk of you being denied at the port of entry, which of course we want to mitigate every possible risk that you wouldn't be able to come back to the United States. So just keep in mind, it is really just that small window of time that we would not advise that you travel on OPT. I also should mention, because we get this question fairly frequently, if you have your EAD card and it's after your program completion date and it's before the authorized start date of your OPT, that's fine. You're still allowed to travel internationally and return, even if your OPT hasn't officially started yet, if you have your EAD card in hand. Again, that is going to be fine. The problem is really when you're after your program end date and you don't have the EAD card. All right, so moving on to unemployment and OPT. So just a quick note that there is a difference between your OPT authorization period and the days of employment, or rather there might be a difference. So your OPT authorization period, once you have that EAD card, that is a fixed period of time. The majority of you will apply and you'll get your EAD card, which will have your authorization dates on it for 12 full months. But just note that the day that you start working, unless you start working as of the first day that you're authorized for OPT, you're going to start accruing what's called days of unemployment. And so many of you, if you already have a job lined up, maybe you're going to request your OPT start date to be the start date of your offer, which is great. And so maybe you won't have accrued any days of unemployment, but just keep in mind that from the first day that you're authorized for OPT, as per your EAD card, if you are not employed on that day, then that will be 1 day of unemployment that you've accrued. And it's okay to accrue days of unemployment. They're there for a reason. Again, you are eligible for 90 days of unemployment throughout that entire 12 months of OPT. But just something to keep in mind in the back of your mind as you're thinking about your start date on OPT, that you are going to start accruing those from the first day that you're authorized for OPT. Just to clarify, those 90 days of unemployment don't start counting until the authorization period. So for example, if you're graduating on May 21st and you choose a July 1st start date, you're not going to accrue days of unemployment from May 22nd to June 30th. Your days of unemployment are going to start counting from July 1st, from the start date of your OPT authorization. So if your employment is not reported on time, please also note that those days are still going to be considered as days of unemployment. So again, I referenced before that when you have employment on OPT, you do have certain requirements that you have to report any updates to your employment situation. If you get new employment, if you stop working with your employer for whatever reason, you're going to have to report that information to the U.S. government. And we're going to go over what that process looks like later. But sometimes students forget to report. And this is a problem because then on your immigration record, it's going to look like you haven't been working. And so your immigration record is not going to know that you forgot to report it. And so you're going to start accruing days of unemployment, which can be a little bit risky, particularly if your record shows that you've been unemployed for more than 90 days, which would indicate that you're no longer maintaining your F1 status on OPT. So just keep in mind your employment reporting obligations on OPT are super important. It's your responsibility to keep up with them. And if you forget to report in a timely manner, then you will start accruing days of unemployment, which could negatively impact your status. Just also a quick reminder, because we get this question a lot, is that taking vacation while you are employed is not necessarily considered unemployment. If you get paid time off with your employer and you're just taking a week to kind of relax and recuperate, but you're still employed with a company while you're taking that vacation, those days are not going to count toward your days of unemployment. Similarly, the weekends are not going to count towards your days of unemployment if you're working in a job that doesn't necessarily expect you to work on the weekends. As long as you are on that company's payroll and you are still employed by that company, you're not accruing those days of unemployment. So now I'm going to turn it over to Leah, who's going to walk us through this OPT authorization timeline.
Great. And we've had a number of questions about it that I hope will be addressed as we talk about these specific timelines and different options that you have for choosing that authorization start date, when you can start working during that authorization period, and then what is the latest that you could begin working while on OPT within that authorization period. And we will I'm tracking all of the questions and we will get to those at the end. So thank you for continuing to put those in the chat. So this OPT authorization timeline that you can see in front of you, Zaina has talked about all of these elements, and we're just going to have a visual to capture everything at this point. So your program end date on your I-20, if you are graduating in May of 2023, it should be May 21st, 2023. If your I-20 has a different program end date, maybe it says May 2024, and you're like, actually, I'm graduating early, then in the OPT application process, we will update that end date on your I-20. You can still apply as long as you are expecting to complete your program this May 2023. You're going to use this May 21st, 2023 end date. So this May 21st date is important because it sets a couple of different timelines that Zaina has talked about. The first is it sets the first day that you can submit your application to USCIS, which is going to be February 20th based on this end date. It's going to determine the last date that you can submit that application to USCIS, which is going to be July 20th. We do not recommend that anybody waits until July 20th to submit your OPT application. There's no benefit. Sometimes students think, well, I'll get more time on OPT, but you'll actually lose time with that application. If you apply so late, they will take it out of your 12 months. So that's important, that February 20th to July 20th, that's the window in which you can submit the application to USCIS for your authorization. The other thing that's determined by that program end date is the start of the authorization period that you can choose from. So again, you are going to choose that authorization start date between May 21st and July 20th. So an authorization start date might be May 22nd is the first one that you can choose. The last possible start date that you can choose is July 20th. And that authorization start date is really important because of one, once it's on the EAD card, that establishes the start date for when you need to begin reporting employment. And if you aren't beginning to report employment, then your unemployment days will start to accrue. Somebody had a question about, is it the 12 months? Does that include the 90 days or is it 12 months plus 90 days? You will be authorized only for 12 months for the first section of OPT, or for your OPT if you don't have a STEM extension. So that 12 months is total. The 90 days is taken from that 12 months. It's not consecutive. You don't get to restart every time you have a break. It's cumulative over that 12 months. You are allowed 90 unemployment days. So if somebody chooses the very last possible start date, so July 20th, because you don't have a job right now and you're kind of nervous about whether you're going to find one in time, and you choose that July 20th authorization start date, then you need to be employed by October 18th of this year. Sometime in that window, you have those 90 days. The last possible date that you can report employment and become employed is October 18th. So you really do have a lot of time right now. If you choose that July 20th authorization start date, you have a lot of time to find a job and to begin reporting that employment, okay? Someone asked a question, though, like, what if I choose July 20th and then I get a job and I want to start working earlier, but July 20th is what I put on, I requested on my EAD card. Unfortunately, once you have submitted that application to USCIS, you cannot change the authorization dates that you've requested. It's pretty final once you've submitted that. So if you choose July 20th and you get an amazing job, maybe on campus, a professor's like, actually, I really could use you to do some research. Do you want to try and work with me for the summer? Or an employer comes to you and says, man, we really need people to start July 1st. It doesn't matter if you chose July 20th as that authorization start date. If an opportunity comes to you outside of those authorization dates, you'll have to decline it. So there is some strategy in determining how to choose that start date. Some students don't have a job right now and they're choosing June 1st because they want to be ready for any opportunity that comes up in the next 4 months. And that's a great strategy. Other students say, you know what, I'm not sure, but I don't want to risk using up all of my unemployment over the summer. So I'm going to choose July 1st. And other students just say, I don't want to worry about this. If July 20th is the last possible date that I can choose for my OPT authorization start date, that's the date I'm going to choose. So ultimately, if you don't have a job right now, you could choose any of those dates, anytime between May 22nd and July 20th. Are your options? It's totally up to you and your degree of how flexible you want to be to accept job opportunities, or how focused you want to be in getting something and getting started this summer. It's your choice. If you have a job offer, one more thing. If you have a job offer and you know you're going to start on July 1st with your new employer, then you can choose July 1st as your authorization start date. It just means you cannot do anything until July 1st. For those of you who maybe don't have a job until it starts in October 1st or September 1st, then we would recommend that you choose that July 20th, unless you want to be flexible to take other opportunities over the course of the summer. But that July 20th means that that's your authorization start date. You don't start working until August 1st, September 1st, October 1st. That's fine. You'll accrue those unemployment days, but there's no negative impact of using those unemployment days. And so it's just about being strategic for, you just want to use all of your employment with your employer once you start August, September, October, then choose that July 20th end date. Okay, next slide. So a couple of scenarios that we've seen come through pretty consistently, and we just want to talk through them with you. So you may see your situation here. So our first student, all of these are May 2023 grads. Our first student has a job offer, and the start date of that job is May 22nd of this year. And they have a visa that is valid through May 22nd of this year, but they do want to visit home in the next year. So this student has a few different things to consider. First, we definitely want them to submit their application the very first day that they're eligible, that February 20th to USCIS. They probably should have already requested their I-20 with OPT recommendation from our office so that they're ready to submit everything on February 20th. That start date is pretty tight, but fortunately we are seeing, as Dana noted, USCIS is processing very quickly these days, but they still want to get that application in as soon as possible, because you all in the Zoom room and 10,000, 30,000, 50,000 other students are all applying for OPT right now. So the student's going to get their application in early. That visa is fine once it expires. The student is here, they're present in the US, they do not need a valid visa to remain in the US, but as soon as they exit the US, they are going to have to apply for that new visa. And so they're going to have their the different travel documents that Dana referenced earlier. They're going to have the I-20, they're going to have the their passport. They're going to carry their EAD card and maybe the job offer letter to show at the consulate appointment to show that, yes, indeed, I do have a reason to return to the US. But in this case, we want the student to get their application in early and be ready to go for that May 22nd. The second student has a job offer as well. The start date is September 1st, and they want to go home over the summer until August 15th, and they have a valid visa through August 30th of this year. So this student, again, even though their start date isn't until September, we want them to get their application in as soon as possible, particularly because they have plans to travel. And so Zaina noted earlier, we don't want students traveling after the program end date and before you have the approval notice, or they have the approval notice. So this student wants to get that EAD card in hand, or at least the approval notice, before they exit the US after they've graduated. The good news is that the student has a valid visa through their travel dates. So even though there are only 2 weeks left on their visa, they'll still be able to come back to the US, re-enter. They'll be eligible to do that with that current visa, their I-20, the approval notice, and maybe the job offer letter is just additional evidence for the CBP officer at the border. This student is going to use up about a month and a half of their OPT unemployment days, and that's totally fine. She's being strategic and using those. She's getting time in with her family. She's prioritizing things as she wants them. The only thing I would note on this student is we have seen a number of students go home for shorter visits when they had a valid visa, and they would have a valid visa to re-enter the US. And they thought, oh, I'll just apply for the new visa now and get ahead of it so I don't have to worry about it. And unfortunately, we've just seen a number of denials in those short terms where students have been pushed into administrative processing. So we would advise that if you have a valid visa for your return to the US, then just come back to the US. Do not get caught into the consular processing right now. It's still pretty backlogged from COVID, and we don't want students to get stuck and have all of your timelines for employment and travel impacted by delayed consular processing of a new visa. Both of these students are going to apply for a new F1 visa stamp because, as Dana noted earlier, they're still on F1 status and they're accessing this OPT benefit, but every visa stamp, while you're on OPT or STEM OPT, will still be the F1 visa stamp. The next student is planning to return home to their home country to work after graduation, and they have no intention of applying for OPT. And while all of you here are probably intending to apply for OPT, we just want to note that the only time you can apply for OPT is really now through July 20th if you stay in the US through July 20th. Once you leave the US after your program end date, if you have not filed an OPT application, then you have lost that OPT benefit. So it's really important that you understand this is the window in which to apply for OPT. We have had students who said, I'm just going to go home. I don't want the OPT benefit. And then 5 months later, 6 months later, they call us and say, I just found a great job in the US and now I want to apply for OPT. And if you're calling us after you've left the US, after your program end date, it's too late at that point. The fourth student is also graduating this May. She does not have an offer, but she is looking, and her visa is expired, but she doesn't plan on traveling. And so we would advise the student, be strategic in choosing that start date. But get your application in as soon as possible, because once you have the EAD card in hand with those authorization start dates, you can speak with employers with much more confidence and make a much more informed decision about when you'll be ready to work, when you'll be authorized to work, and have all of those other steps after that process set for you in a way that if you're sort of like, I don't know if I want to do it, I don't know, and you wait too long, then you're losing out on some of the flexibility of choosing a good authorization start date. So, and just to highlight again here, the OPT unemployment, especially because there was a few questions about it, is that if you choose July 20th, that last possible start date, authorization start date, then you do have until October 18th before you need to report employment. If you do not report any employment by October 18th, then you will have to leave the US immediately. But if you choose July 1st, then that unemployment day starts, the count starts on July 1st, and you need to have employment by October 1st. So just know that that sliding scale of OPT, it's based on your authorization start date that's printed on the EAD card. It's contained within those 12 months. And it's important that you're strategic about when you choose those and use those in choosing that authorization start date. And a few other things, just again, reminders, you're going to say, we've already heard this, Leah, but it's really important that you hear it one more time. One is that authorization is for 12 months total, but you have to report the employment. So just having the authorization, it is a blanket authorization. You can take advantage of so many different kinds of employment, but you have to report that, and you only have those 12 months in which to find employment, report it for the first 12 months of OPT. Again, clarifying that your employment start date may differ from that authorization start date, and it might require you to use some of your unemployment days, but there's no negative impact on your status or future petitions by using your unemployment days. Those are a benefit within the benefit of F1 OPT. You do want to consider, as you're choosing that authorization start date, we have every summer a student come to us and say, oh my gosh, my professor, my dissertation advisor, someone wants me to keep working over the summer, and I would like to do that. But unfortunately, you have to have the authorization start date in hand, June 1st, July 1st, before you can take advantage of those summer opportunities. If you want to be flexible with accepting a position, you need to choose an earlier start date. And once you have set that start date with USCIS and you submit it to USCIS, it cannot be changed. There was a question about whether if you've already gotten the I-20 from ISSA, but you have not submitted it to USCIS, can you still change the start date or just cancel your I-20 with OPT recommendation? You can, you just need to notify us that you want to cancel the OPT recommendation that you received. And then if you need to apply at a later date, that's no problem. But once you've submitted to USCIS, you're really, you have set the, you've just made that decision to apply. You might be able to cancel it in the future, but it's very risky. And so we recommend just applying when you are for sure ready to submit that application. We've been talking a bunch about the EAD card. This is what it will look like, and it's an employment authorization document. Really important, again, that you do not begin working before you have the card in hand and you have reached the authorization start date on the card. And you can see at the very bottom right-hand corner are some dates that indicate when this card was authorized for, June 19 to June 2020. So it's really important. You have to have that card in hand. You need to reach the authorization start date. You will get an approval notice before you get the EAD card. And that approval notice is just letting you know that the EAD card is coming. You cannot work with that approval notice. You have to have this card in hand before you begin working. A few other notes is that this is not a travel document. The F1 visa stamp and your I-20 are what's needed to enter the US, but the CBP officer may ask for it. Other people may ask for it. Ultimately, it's not a travel document. You must have a valid F1 visa. You must have a valid I-20 with the signature from our office in order to enter the US every time while you're on OPT. And then lastly, occasionally USCIS does make a mistake. And so if your EAD card is not correct, maybe your name is not correct, maybe the dates aren't what you thought you had requested, but please reach out to us and we'll help you get that corrected if possible. So a few reminders about the reporting responsibilities. You've had different reporting responsibilities while you have been an enrolled student, making sure that ISSA is aware of your home address, making sure that if your major changed, that you reached out to us, making sure that if there was any changes in the program end date that you reached out to let us know, or if you needed a program extension. And you have two primary reporting responsibilities while you're on OPT. The first is the same as when you were enrolled, and that's that you must report every change to your residential address to our office, and you must report any change in employment to our office. Both of those changes have to be reported to our office within 10 days of the change. The thing to note about reporting your employment is you can't backdate. So if you forget to report your employment to us, there's not a way for you to backdate it in the system. You can only backdate it 10 days for that 10-day limitation. And so it's really essential that you ensure that you are reporting on time to our office. And I keep saying our office, but actually there is an option, and you will receive an email about the Student Exchange Visitor Program portal after you have graduated and you have entered your authorization period. And the SEVP portal will send you an email that says, hey, set up an account. And then you will be able to access your basically your SEVIS record, portions of your SEVIS record, so that you can report your address and employment directly to SEVIS. And we would advise you, even if you want to continue to report it to ISSA via ISSA link, you can do that after graduation. There's a slightly different reporting mechanism after graduation. But we would still recommend that you set up that SEVP portal account so that you always know what's going on in your SEVIS record. So we strongly recommend that. That email is going to come, and the link usually expires pretty quickly. So reach out to us if you need it to be updated. So I'm going to talk about two things that are not necessarily related to the first 12 months of OPT, but very briefly, we want to touch on the 24-month STEM OPT extension for those of you who will be applying for that in the future. So a couple of things to know about the application process. The first is that right now, every single student on the Zoom call who is graduating in May of 2023 is only applying for 12 months of OPT, regardless of whether you have the STEM major or not. So every student is applying for the first 12 months of OPT. This time next year, when you are within 90 days of the end date of your OPT authorization period, you will reach out to our office for us to issue an I-20 with the OPT STEM recommendation. And then you will submit another application to USCIS for those extra 24 months if you have a STEM designated major. You cannot apply more than 90 days before that OPT EAD card end date. And you are going to basically follow the exact same process that you did for OPT. You're going to reach out to ISSA. You're going to fill out a form. You are going to pay the $410 filing fee. The main difference between OPT and STEM OPT in the application process is that you are also required to fill out an I-983 training plan with your employer and with your supervisor. A few other differences with the STEM OPT extension, in addition to that application, that extra document for the application, is that you have to have a much more traditional employer-employee relationship. So someone has to be supervising you and someone has to sign off on that training plan. The employer must be e-verified with the US government, and the employment, again, must be more than 20 hours a week. And you have to have that training plan for every employer. So some students on STEM do have multiple employers, but that training plan is a requirement of applying for the STEM extension and for reporting any employment. So all of you will be thinking about this if you have a STEM designated major this time next year, and we will send reminders throughout the year to you. The second thing we've gotten a number of questions about is that if you have an employer that is going to be filing for you in the H-1B lottery, we've had questions about, can you file both applications at the same time, the OPT application and the employer filing the H-1B application? So that H-1B petition is a separate process from OPT. It is totally fine to submit applications on both, in both status, right? So the F1 OPT, you can submit that same time that your employer is submitting the H-1B application for you. They're separate, they don't conflict, it's fine. We do generally recommend in any case, whether you're doing H-1B or maybe permanent residency or a TN or any other status in the US, that you maintain your F1 student status until you have an approval notice and approval documentation for the new status. This is going to be your underlying status until another status is approved. And so you want to continue to report to our office. You want to keep the OPT, make sure that you have employment, that you are maintaining it until you have notification of that new status. For H-1B, some of you will find out in maybe June that you've been approved for the H-1B, in which case you can stay in the US until October 1st, until that H-1B start date, authorization start date begins. I'm sorry, October 1st. I did say October 1st. You can stay in the US. You don't have to work then, as long as you have the approval notice for that H-1B. We would always recommend, keep doing what you're going to do in F1 status, but if you have the approval notice, then you could pivot and stop working. I noted that October 1st date, all H-1B petitions as a part of the lottery, the authorization start date is October 1st. Occasionally, if they haven't processed your application in time, it will be pushed back to October 15th or November 1st, whenever they process your application. But that is the main date. And we would recommend that when you have that approval notice from USCIS, that you submit that to our office via the End Status form and ISSA link, so that we can make sure that SEVIS updates your status on October 1st to a change of status with H-1B. And then the last one, we occasionally get a question, are you required to work with the same employer that you worked with on OPT and H-1B? And no, again, they're two very separate application processes, and they can be separate employers. They have separate reporting responsibilities. They do not overlap. So that's our main thing with that.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to take it back. This slide is predominantly just meant to make the distinction for you all between the work, the immigration side of this OPT process, and then the career and employment side. And so ISSA and USCIS are the entities that are primarily responsible for doing the immigration side of this process. And so we want to make the distinction where it's like if you are having questions about filing for OPT, then that's something that we can assist you with. But if you're having trouble getting a job, we can't necessarily facilitate the process of finding employment for you. And so you're really going to be working with perhaps career development, maybe networking with other employers, and potentially like your department, your academic advisor or your faculty advisor, who may be able to tell you where previous students in your program went on to work or find employment. So there's several entities at play here. And just to note that ISSA is primarily involved in the immigration and procedural aspect of the OPT process. So what does this look like actually getting into the nitty-gritty of it? What does this process look like? And so we mentioned that the first step of this process is requesting this updated OPT I-20 from ISSA. You need a recommendation from the ISSA office in order to submit that formal application to USCIS. And so in order to request this, you are going to submit the OPT application request e-form through ISSA link. Hopefully at this point, all of you have accessed us through ISSA link before. ISSA link is accessible through Inside ND. And this is where you make all of your requests to the ISSA office for updated documentation. And so if you log in and you'll see the F1 practical training option on the left-hand panel. If you click it, you'll see one of the forms is this OPT application request form. So you'll open it up, you'll submit it, you'll complete the information, and part of this section that you need to complete is also involving you putting your academic advisor or your faculty advisor's information, and then they are actually going to have to sign off on this request form before ISSA can process it and issue your new I-20. And we're going to go over kind of what they have to do on their end in one of the upcoming slides. But ultimately, once you submit this e-form, ISSA is going to process it. Our processing time is about 5 to 8 business days for any request. And so within 5 to 8 business days of when we have that completed request, we will process it and issue you an updated OPT I-20. This little screenshot here on the right side is what your page 2 of the I-20 is going to look like. You have similar information now, but for most of you, this employment authorization section at the top is currently blank, or perhaps you have CPT and your CPT authorization is listed there. Once we issue you this new OPT I-20, then you will see this post-completion OPT requested notation here on the top of page 2. So that's how you'll know that this is your OPT I-20 for the purposes of applying for OPT from USCIS. And there actually was a question in the chat about if this I-20 that we issue you is the one you should use moving forward. And so to answer that, yes, this will be your new I-20 moving forward. You should always be using your most recent I-20 for any official intents and purposes, things like traveling, renewing a visa. So yes, the new I-20 with the OPT recommendation will be your most recent I-20 that you should use both for the purposes of applying for OPT, but then also for things like travel after that. So on our website, hopefully all of you know that we have our website, and one of the pages about OPT goes over this application process fairly thoroughly. We give you step-by-step instructions over what this process looks like, and you'll also see a list of the documents that you're going to need to have in order to submit this online application for OPT. This is literally a screenshot of what that web page looks like. So you can, even if you do a quick Google search, Notre Dame ISSA OPT, our webpage will be the first option to pop up, and you can take a look at the information there. So everything we're covering today is also going to be on that webpage. And just a quick note that this recording will also be available for you to view later if you'd like from that webpage. Anyway, so you can refer to the page for the documents that you can start gathering. I will also mention that when you submit your I-20 request to ISSA, while you're waiting those 5 to 8 business days for us to process that I-20, during that time, it would be a good idea for you to start gathering the rest of the documentation that you're going to need to submit as part of this application. And then that way, once you get the I-20 from ISSA, you have everything ready to go. And as soon as that 90th day comes around, again, for most of you, that's going to be February 20th, you'll have everything you need to go ahead and submit that application to USCIS to formally apply for OPT. So then naturally, your final step is going to be submitting that application through the USCIS platform. So I mentioned that that your academic advisor has a small role to play in this process of getting the I-20 from the ISSA office. So we kind of created this chart just to make it a little bit easier for you all to see what the responsibilities are of each of us in this process of getting you this OPT I-20, both you as the student, your academic advisor, and then ultimately the ISSA office who's going to issue you the I-20. So as we mentioned, you are responsible, you're driving this process, you are responsible for understanding your responsibilities while on OPT. Again, that's also listed on our OPT webpage if you want to review it now or potentially months from now when you're actually on OPT, that webpage information will be there. You're going to request this I-20 from ISSA link and then follow up on either the application or potentially your academic advisor's recommendation. So the reason that we put this line here is because it may help if your academic advisor or your department advisor, whoever's can confirm your progress in your program, if they know that this is coming. So you are going to put in their email address information when you submit your portion of the ISSA OPT request form, and then an email is automatically going to be generated to them, and they are going to have to click the link and complete their portion. And so sometimes it's helpful if they know that it's coming, so you may want to follow up with them just to let them know to look out for this, so that there's no delay. I will note that ISSA cannot move forward with your OPT I-20 request until we have both your part of the form and their part of the form. Sometimes we have students follow up with us and they're like, hey, it's been more than 8 business days. What's going on with my I-20? Where is it? And we're going to say, oh, well, we never got the confirmation from your advisor. Please follow up with them to have them complete it so that we can move forward with processing. It doesn't come to us as a completed request until we have both parts. You are responsible then for monitoring your email to get the I-20, printing it out, signing it, and ultimately submitting your application packet to USCIS and tracking that application, and then ultimately maintaining your status while on OPT, which, as we mentioned previously, mostly involves reporting your employment and any updates to your US address throughout the duration of your OPT authorization period. Your advisor will have to complete their portion of the form. Essentially what they are doing is verifying your program completion date and confirming with us that you've made normal academic progress and you are in fact graduating and completing your academic program from Notre Dame. And then ISSA is going to verify your eligibility. We are going to recommend you for OPT. Again, this recommendation comes in the form of a new OPT I-20 that we're going to send to you as a PDF. We issue the I-20 with the OPT recommendation, and then you will, again, print it out, hand sign it, and use it to formally apply for OPT. So what exactly does this process look like? What is the Form I-765? So the I-765 is the formal application to USCIS for employment authorization. So what are some things to know about this process? So the employment authorization document, which we just took a look at when Leah covered what that looks like and kind of what information is going to be on there. This card is issued as evidence that you are approved for post-completion OPT and that you are sorry, my cat is trying to make an appearance in our OPT video, that you are approved for your category of work authorization and that you are authorized to work in the United States. When we say your category of work authorization, Your application is tied to a particular eligibility category, which you are going to indicate at the time that you are completing the the online I-765, which is that formal application with USCIS. It should be very intuitive which option you should select. There is a drop-down menu for you to choose what category of work authorization you are applying for. So for post-completion OPT, which I imagine is the majority of you here, that category is going to be C3B, and that information is also going to be printed on that EAD card once you receive it. For any of you that may now or in the future be applying for the STEM OPT extension, that category is different. It is C3C. Just to note that you must file your OPT application while you're physically present in the United States. So if you're planning to travel in the coming weeks, we would recommend either filing for your OPT before you go, as long as you're within that 90-day window, or waiting until you return to the United States to file. And the reason this is important is because as part of that OPT application, one of the documents that you're going to need to submit is that I-94 record, which updates every time you depart and re-enter the United States. And so if you are outside of the United States, your I-94 record is actually not valid. And then you would get a new I-94 record when you return. And so it's really important, and per government guidance, you should be physically present in the United States at the time that you file your application. And then we also want to mention that following our instructions and this guide does not necessarily guarantee approval. We do our best to advise you and answer any questions that you may have. But we are not the entity that is approving your OPT application, and it is ultimately up to the discretion of USCIS to approve the OPT application and issue your EAD card. Hopefully, if you are attending this session and you ask all of your questions to us at ISSA, there is a very low chance that you won't get approved, but it is just important to note that we are not the ones making the final decision on your application. It is an application like any other. So regarding the USCIS process, regarding the form I-765, first of all, students should contact ISSA if your application is rejected or denied. The reason that this is super important is because the recommendation on the I-20 that we give you is actually for post-OPT only valid for 30 days from when we issue it to you. And so if for whatever reason you apply for OPT and your application is rejected or denied, you may still be eligible to refile, but it may be outside that 30-day window from when we issued you that OPT recommendation I-20. And so again, you may still be able to refile if you're still within the eligibility window, like if you're still within that 90 days before your program completion date, but we would need to issue you a new I-20 with an updated OPT recommendation. So the important thing to note is that if there's something wonky happening with your application status, if you've received notification that it's been denied or rejected, please talk to us as soon as possible so that we can advise you on the next steps. F1 students are not authorized to work until the EAD card is in hand and the start date printed on the card has been reached. So again, we've mentioned this a few times already, but it's super important to note that just having been approved for OPT is not necessarily enough to allow you to start working. You must have that EAD card in hand, and you will have to provide it to your employer as proof of your eligibility to work in the United States. And also you have to be within the OPT authorization period that's indicated on the card. Again, the dates of your OPT authorization are going to be on the EAD card itself. An approval notice, as I mentioned, is not the same as an authorization. So you may have noticed that you've been approved, but you are not eligible to start working again until you have that EAD card and until you're within the authorization period. That's very, very important. Only you as the applicant can contact USCIS regarding your application. So if you're outside the US and your friend is willing to contact USCIS for you, please note that that is not going to be an option and that you will have to contact them yourself regarding the application. Something that may be helpful to note is that when you submit that OPT application to USCIS, very soon after, you are going to receive a receipt notice regarding that application with a receipt number on on it. And that receipt number is essentially, that's tied to your OPT application. So if there's any follow-up that has to happen about your application, you're going to need to have that number handy. And if something happens, like you're rejected or denied, or you need any sort of assistance from ISSA, we may also need that, that receipt number to assist you. So just may be helpful for you to know to keep that, keep a record of that receipt notice and that receipt number. Also, applications are processed first in, first out, or first come, first served, which is why we recommend that you apply as early as possible for OPT, so that hopefully you will just get your approval that much sooner. So next, just referencing some common mistakes and how to avoid them. It is your responsibility to make sure that you do not submit your application more than 90 days before your program end date. We've talked about this 90-day window. It is not negotiable. It's not an estimate. It is exactly 90 days, and submitting before that 90-day window will result in an automatic rejection of your application. And there's no guarantee that USCIS is going to refund your money. In fact, they probably will not refund it. So if you pay and you get denied, then you're probably going to be out that $410. So really important that you don't submit early, even though we understand that you're anxious about this process and that you just want to be done with it. Make sure that you're not submitting earlier than that 90-day window. Again, that the 90th day before your program completion date is February 20th if you are a May 21st, 2023 grad. But that period, that 90-day window does not change depending on your completion date. So if your completion date is actually going to be over the summer, then you're still only able to apply 90 days before whatever that end date is. Please make sure that your new I-20 has the OPT recommendation on page 2. Sometimes we at ISSA make mistakes as well. So really just review that I-20, make sure the information is correct. Hopefully it's not going to be an issue, but we did show you what that page 2 of your I-20 should look like with that OPT recommendation, where we put those recommended dates on there that you're going to indicate to us. So please review that information. Just make sure everything looks good. And if you have any questions or concerns, definitely reach out to us before submitting that application. And of course, make sure that you're using the correct I-20 when you submit the application. You are going to have that OPT recommendation I-20 in order to submit the formal USCIS application. Do not submit an I-20 that doesn't have an OPT recommendation on it. Make sure that you file within 30 days of when ISSA issues your I-20 with the OPT recommendation. So just to reiterate that the recommendation that we give you is only valid for 30 days at a time. And that doesn't mean that you can only apply for 30 days. It just means that if you get the OPT I-20 from ISSA and you're still not sure that you want to apply for OPT, so you wait about a month, and then, a few weeks later, you're like, oh yeah, actually, I do want to apply for OPT. Then please get back in touch with us, because the chances that recommendation is still valid are probably low. And so it may just be better for us to go ahead and cancel that recommendation, re-recommend you for OPT to restart that 30-day clock for you. So just keep that in mind as well. And then, of course, we are going to issue you this new OPT I-20 as a PDF attachment to an email. It will have our digital signature on it, but you yourself are required to print it out and hand sign it. And then you can scan or take a picture of that I-20 to submit with your online OPT application. But you yourself should always, anytime you get a new I-20, print it out, hand sign it, and retain that hard copy with you, because that is the original I-20, the one that you hand sign. You should not be submitting an I-20 that has a digital signature. And that is true of any I-20 that you receive throughout your entire F1 program. So regarding the online filing, so again, we mentioned you need to print and hand sign the Form I-20 with the OPT recommendation, and then you can scan it or take pictures of it for an electronic copy to upload to your I-765 or the formal OPT application that you're going to file online with USCIS. You are able to create a free USCIS account, which you'll need to do in order to access the online filing system. We actually, if you review our webpage information, as I mentioned, we give you step-by-step instructions, and we link you to the website where you can set up this free USCIS account to start this application. Make sure that you review all of the required materials. Again, the screenshot that I shared from our OPT website, we give you a list of all the documents you should be prepared to have to upload to the USCIS system. And again, I did recommend that when you submit the request to ISSA for the OPT I-20, while you're waiting for that, it's a good time for you to go ahead and start getting these materials ready, so that you know you have everything together all in one place. As soon as you get that new I-20, you just take pictures or scan it to have an electronic copy, and you can go ahead and start that online application with USCIS. Make sure to have your credit card information to be ready to enter for the payment. The payment of the $410 fee is going to be the last step of that application. And so you'll need to pay it before you're going to be able to submit the application. And then lastly, it is up to you to monitor the status of your application through the USCIS portal. So it'll tell you in that portal where your application is at as it moves through processing. So it's not the most helpful in terms of, it doesn't update that often, but it will tell you when your card is being produced, when your application has been approved. It will, the status will change throughout processing. So it may be helpful for you to monitor that. And then again, just a reminder to keep that receipt number on file, just in case you do need to follow up or you need assistance from ISSA regarding the application. All right. And then there is a training on the online portal that you can access through YouTube regarding the online filing system for OPT. It's not necessarily required, but if it's something you're interested in viewing, it is available to you. All right. I'm going to turn it back over to Leah to close us out.
Okay. So just a couple of things before we get to all the questions that you guys put into the chat. On this slide, there's really the two things in the gold that I want to make sure that you're all clear on. While you are on OPT, if you have any employment opportunity, if it's paid, if it's unpaid, it's 1 day, 1 month, it doesn't matter. Make sure that you report it via the SAVP portal or through ISSA link so that that stops that unemployment clock and the government is as clear about your employment status as you are. The second thing is that if you have any opportunity that is outside of the authorization period or your major, you will have to decline it. And you can always reach out to us with questions about, I'm not sure if this actually will connect with my major. We can give you some advice for how to assess that. But ultimately, it has to be connected to your major. That employment opportunity must be within the authorization period. We are really here to help you throughout the process. You will still continue to connect with the ISSA office after graduation. Please always feel free to email us. You will have access to ISSA link. We're really the only office that should be advising you on your F1 status and your F1 OPT. So please don't hesitate to reach out. It's your responsibility to manage this process, but we are here to assist you. And to that end, if you go to our website, and we'll put the link in the chat shortly, we have 100, 200 hours of advising appointments in the next 3 or 4 weeks, really dedicated to helping students manage the OPT process. 10-minute meeting, answer your questions that are specific to your situation. We're glad to look at the online application. If you're just nervous about hitting submit on it, any questions that you have, please grab one of those appointment slots. Come to our walk-in hours on Tuesday and Wednesday from 2 to 4. We really are here to support you. We really want you to be successful so that you can use your Notre Dame degree to go forward into the world and do amazing things. The final kind of next steps for you is after this, if you haven't already gone to ISSA link and started filling out that OPT application, you're going to want to do that. Once you have that Form I-20 from our office, you will be ready to submit your application. And so you're going to find all of your documentation that you need for the application, your I-94 record, your most recent I-94 record, your passport, any CPT I-20s. If you've had CPT while you are enrolled at this education level, you're going to gather all of those and start working on your USCIS application. And then you'll wait for the date where you're eligible to apply. So those are your next steps, is getting into ISSA link, checking out the OPT application form there to get that I-20 with the recommendation. So before we jump to the questions, just a reminder that's really your decision about what your timeline is going to be in terms of that authorization start date, employment, When you submit the application, you're really driving this process. Our team is here to support you, but you're really driving it. A reminder that USCIS does not guarantee processing times. And so we talked about how it's been about a month and a half for some students in the last 6 months, but that might change, and they make no promises about how long the application will take. So we do want you to apply as soon as possible. And then again, you do not need a job offer to apply. You will have to decide when you want to be eligible to begin working in the US after graduation, but you don't need a specific offer. And we just want to encourage you to be flexible. You're going to hand this off to the US government. You're going to wait on them to get back to you. But ultimately, it will get itself sorted out in the next 6 months. So just remain flexible and know that some things are out of your hands, and do what you can with what you have control over. I think, Zaina, if you stop sharing it and then share it again, you'll see all the questions that came through, and we can just pop through those maybe back and forth. I will start just with the top one because there's a couple of questions about dependents. So if you have a dependent, there you go. If you have a dependent, I-20, no matter how many you have, as soon as you submit that application for OPT, their I-20 will also be extended. It's not like the visa where you're applying for a separate visa for them. In this case, their I-20 will be extended with your I-20 once you have that OPT authorization. And you will get an updated I-20 for them when you request the OPT recommendation I-20. If you don't, because sometimes the system doesn't issue them automatically, you can just reach out to us for that updated documentation. The changing start date I reference is that you can defer if you've already requested the OPT I-20. If you have already submitted your application to USCIS, you cannot change that authorization start date. But the really good news is, and Zaina referenced this, is that if you are a PhD student, then you can continue to be working on your dissertation after the official program end date on your I-20, as long as you finish it in your first 12 months of OPT for our PhD students. If you are a master's student or an undergraduate student who has to take another class after the program end date, then unfortunately you will not be able to start working on OPT until that coursework is finished. So if you get to the end of the semester, you need one more class for any reason, your program end date stays the same. You still have your EAD card with the authorization start dates, but you will have to wait. In some cases, I believe you can work part-time until your coursework is done, but you will have to work on that coursework and reach out to us with any questions. And I believe there was another question about if a student is walking at graduation, but they know they're not going to actually be graduating until later in the summer, then you can walk in graduation, but we would recommend you actually choose that program end date for your actual graduation date so that you can complete that coursework and it pushes out your employment authorization start dates and timelines. On the ISSA link form for those students who have the master's degree with the thesis or exam, if you've had both, really it's just a matter, if you have the master's with thesis, you have a little more flexibility on your program end date. It's based on your thesis date, but you do not have to, either one is fine if you think they both apply to you. Zaina, you're welcome to grab any of these. I don't need to do all of them.
Oh, you're fine. You can continue.
Okay. I've been tracking them.
Okay.
I think someone was asking about the employment start date. So if you find an employment offer that starts 2 months after graduation, it's really going to be based on what authorization start date you chose. Are you going to be able to take that opportunity or not? So just be really strategic about the authorization start date and know that you may have to be flexible when you begin working during that authorization period. If you have questions about you're going to plan to work outside of the US, then I would say meet with an advisor, because there are some limitations on how much you can do outside of the US and the employment relationship. And are you really based in the US if you are fully employed outside of the US? There's just some different questions. So if you have questions specifically because you plan to work remotely for the bulk of your OPT authorization period, I would recommend you set up a 10 minute appointment with an advisor to talk through that. The next question is about the visa expiration dates. And again, we mentioned earlier that if you try to apply for a new visa over spring break or sometime in April, maybe or an interterm, if you're in Mendoza, there is some risk that you will not get that visa back in time and you will not be able to come back and finish your program. And the primary purpose for all of you should be to finish the program. So if you have a valid visa through May 13th and you will be traveling this spring, but entering before May 13th, then we would not recommend that you get a new visa. Because again, you want to be able to finish your program on campus. There's not going to be a remote option if you get stuck outside of the country, and that will delay your graduation date. It may mean that you can't apply for OPT in the future. So please just make sure that you have, that you're really thoughtful about that visa application appointment, and reach out to our office if you have any more specific questions about your situation. For those of you, the question about the grace period, if you use up all of your unemployment days and you have to leave, you really do need to be outside of the country when that OPT expires. So we would say there's not, I don't believe, Zaina, there's an official grace period. Once that you've used up all your unemployment days, you should be departing the US. So just be thoughtful about that. There's not really the grace period that you have after your program end date. The next one, and we addressed this in the presentation, so hopefully that was helpful, that if your I-20 currently says May 2024, but you graduate this May, when you submit the OPT application in ISSA Link, we will update your program end date to reflect the May 2023 graduation date. You don't need to request a new I-20 or do anything else until you submit that OPT application. This is a really great question about, can you say you're authorized to work with OPT, or is the answer no at this point? And it really depends on how the employer asks you whether you have authorization to work in the US. What we have seen employers do more and more is that they say, do you need authorization now or ever in the future to work in the US, to figure out what your status is? So our recommendation is that you want to be as honest as possible on the application, but that you will be authorized. There's a very good chance you'll have that authorization, but you may want to talk with somebody in HR and just clarify that you're applying. You expect to be authorized on this date. So it really depends on the phrasing of the question. And if you're not sure if you have a specific phrase, then you can reach out to an advisor or send us an email or set up a 10-minute appointment with us. Related to this is this question of sponsorship, that as you are talking to employers, it's really important to remember that you do not need employer sponsorship for the first 12 months or first 36 months if you have STEM OPT or STEM major. You don't need the employer to sponsor you. You have sponsorship with the OPT benefit. You have authorization to work. Your status is still sponsored by the University of Notre Dame. So you will not need it for that first month or that first 3 year, the first year or the first 3 years if you have the STEM major. So you want to be, again, really clear, depending on how they ask the question, of whether you'll need authorization, just to be honest with them about, yep, in the future I will, but right now I actually have 12 months or potentially 36 months of authorization, work authorization to work. There's a question about having 2 jobs, one remote in the US and another one in the UE. So in this case, you have to start using your OPT right after graduation, and the STEM OPT has to be used right after your 12 months of OPT is finished. So there isn't an option to leave for a while and then come back and apply at a later date. There might be a different option if you're planning to work with the university, that you come back on a J1 or you come back to an employer with H1B. But you need to plan to use that OPT immediately after graduation to access that benefit. And the STEM OPT comes immediately after your OPT is finished. There's no break in that authorization benefit from your graduation date.
Leah, I can hop in because
Please.
I feel like I need a break. Okay, so what if I submit my documents for OPT thinking that I'm going to graduate in May, but actually have to extend to an August graduation? So this is a great question. We kind of mentioned it in the presentation, but essentially once you submit your application for OPT to USCIS, it becomes very difficult to try to withdraw that application and change the completion date. And then after you're authorized for OPT, it is impossible to change any of that information. And so actually we wouldn't advise it once you've submitted the formal OPT application. But if ultimately you're not able to graduate in May and you end up having to graduate in August, then it kind of, I mean, I imagine that the reason that this is, it sounds like maybe it's a doctoral student, maybe you're not going to make your defense date in May. So there is a part of the regulation that allows you to continue finishing your pending requirements for your dissertation while you're working on OPT. So actually, if that's the case, if you have like your dissertation pending and you haven't formally submitted it, it's okay. You can continue working towards your dissertation while you're working full-time on OPT. But keep in mind that those OPT authorized dates are not going to change. So you're still responsible to maintain your status on OPT and not accrue more than 90 days of unemployment while you're finishing that dissertation work. So hopefully that answers that question. If it's a different scenario, then feel free to put it in the chat and we can talk about it at the end. If we return home outside of the US during the summer, what address should we provide? So if you're just going home for like a quick visit, like you're going home for vacation, you don't necessarily have to report an update in your US address since your primary address in the US is likely not changing. If you mean that you're planning to return home on a more definitive basis, then that may have other implications to your OPT. But ultimately, if your primary address in the US isn't changing, even if you're going to be outside the US for a little while, like you're going back home, you're visiting family, you don't have to report an updated address, only if you're changing your primary US address while you're on OPT. Can the employers of a student currently on Leah, did it say CPT or did it say CPE?
I think it meant CPT.
Okay. Can the employers of a student currently on CPT file for H-1B for the student? So that's really a question for the employer. They're the ones that would manage that H-1B filing process. But again, as Leah mentioned before, the F1 status and anything to do with filing for an H-1B are two completely separate these are two separate visa categories. These would be two separate processes that really wouldn't one would not necessarily impact the other unless you were on OPT as an F1 student and then you got approved for a new visa category like an H-1B. But so it is okay for the employer to file if they're planning to file for you. If you have currently CPT, it's not really going to affect it. We would still say, even if your employer is planning to apply for an H-1B for you, we would still advise that you apply for OPT just because at least that way, if the H-1B doesn't go through or doesn't, maybe you don't end up getting approved for the H-1B, at least you still have your OPT to fall back on as a form of work authorization for the next 12 months at least. So I'm a graduate student and I believe I was not pre-assigned an academic advisor. Can I ask one of my professors to be my academic advisor? So this really depends. If you're a doctoral student, then probably a professor or faculty advisor is actually the correct person to sign off on this request. If you don't have an academic advisor, we use that verbiage kind of more generally, but your academic advisor for the purposes of the OPT process is whoever can confirm your academic progress, whoever can confirm to ISSA that you are in fact graduating, that you've met your academic requirements, whoever that person is that's been advising you throughout your program on your courses or your, monitoring your progress, that would be an appropriate person to list for the purposes of the OPT request form with ISSA.
And I would just say that may also be the director of the undergraduate coordinator or the director of graduate studies. That may be in your department the best person to talk to and ask them who would be appropriate to confirm that you're completing your degree requirements.
Great. Is the EAD card sent through mail or do we need to pick it up in person? So when you're filing the I-765, it is going to have you input both your current US physical address and then a US mailing address, which may be the same as your physical address if you're going to be living in the same place for at least the next 3 months. Or if you're not sure where you're going to be living, then you can list a different mailing address, perhaps a friend's mailing address, or maybe you have a family member that lives even somewhere else in the US outside of Indiana. You can list a mailing address, and ultimately USCIS is going to send that EAD card to the mailing address that you list in your I-765 application. I will say that because OPT applications have been getting approved fairly quickly, sometimes students think that they can list their current address as the mailing address and then just change it when they move. Unfortunately, USCIS does not move that quickly, and filing for a change of address is actually a whole other process that requires approval from USCIS. And so when you're putting that mailing address for your EAD card, we do advise that you put an address that you're confident in, that is going to be valid, or that you will have access to for at least the next 3 months, because it can get really complicated if your EAD card ends up at an address that you no longer live at or no longer have access to. So please just keep that in mind. There have been a few other questions that have come in through the chat. Let's see. So regarding our student who it may, if you're not going to make the graduation deadline that you thought you were, if you're not actually going to graduate in May, you need to extend in August, would you be considered unemployed or employed until you defend? So if you've already been approved for OPT at that point, then your 90 days of unemployment are going to start from the day listed on your EAD card. So even if you're finishing up your dissertation, if you are within your OPT authorization period on your EAD card, then you are going to be accruing those 90 days of unemployment. So you would be responsible not only then for finishing your defense and completing the dissertation, but also getting a job and averaging at least 20 hours per week on OPT, working at least 20 hours per week on OPT. So you will still be responsible for maintaining your status on OPT, even though you won't technically have graduated because you'll still have that dissertation pending. I hope that answers that question. Let me know if it doesn't. What if I apply for a given date, but there isn't sufficient time for them to approve for that date? Then what happens? That's a great question. And hopefully that won't be the case if you're applying as early as possible, which is one of the reasons we recommend that you apply really early. But ultimately, if you end up applying later in the application window and you choose a date that may not necessarily be super realistic. So let's say, for example, this is just hypothetically, that you don't apply for your OPT until May 1st. And you're still planning on graduating this spring and your completion date is May 21st, and you want to start working as soon as possible. So you list a requested start date of May 22nd. Well, those 21 days between when you submit the application on May 1st and when you're requesting to start working on May 22nd, that does not give USCIS enough time to review and adjudicate your application for OPT. And so in that case, since that wouldn't be sufficient time for them to approve it, what they're going to do is they're going to move your OPT start date to the date they approve that application. And so they may push it back by a few weeks, depending on how long their processing time is. The only time that starts to become an issue is if you're really late in applying for OPT, and you're not able to get approved by the latest possible start date. So for example, if they're not able to approve you by that July 20th start date, which is the last possible start date for a student who graduated on May 21st, if they're not able to approve you by that date, then they're still going to move the authorized start date for OPT to a later date, but they will not change that latest possible end date, which means that you're just going to be losing a little bit of time off of your 12 months of OPT. So it doesn't mean that you're not going to get approved. It just means that you won't be eligible for that full 12 months if they can't authorize you by that latest possible start date. This again is just one of the reasons why we recommend that you apply as early as you know that you're planning to apply for OPT or that you want to work under your OPT. Will we receive the EAD cards before or after graduation? That's a good question. Hopefully, if you apply sooner, you will get it before graduation. Again, the processing time that we're seeing right now is about a month and a half to 2 months. And we're optimistic that that is going to stay, hopefully, consistent for 2023, as it was for our cohort who applied for OPT in 2022. So if you apply on February 20th, then hopefully you'll receive it by the beginning of April. So there's a good chance you'll get it before graduation. And then if you apply later, then you're just kind of, again, theoretically it's first come, first served. So if you're applying sooner, hopefully they're going to approve you sooner. If you're applying later, then, there may be a little bit of a backlog. It may take them a little bit more time to get through. And again, the biggest implication of not getting your EAD card before graduation is just that ISSA doesn't advise traveling during the time period between the completion date, so probably May 21st, and then when you do actually get your EAD card in hand. So the only implication is that there may be a little bit of a gap where we wouldn't advise traveling outside of the US. All right, so I think that answers all the questions that we have right now. Are there any other questions pending? We will give everyone maybe 2 more minutes to put any questions, any last minute questions in the chat that we can answer for you, or any questions that maybe are more specific to you. We're happy to stick around for a few minutes. So let's see. Can I choose to work for 3 to 4 months instead of 12? Yes, I saw that this question come through before. Apologies that we didn't get to it. So yes, so you can choose to only work for 3 to 4 months. Maybe you're just planning to work over the summer, and then maybe you want to transfer to a new program. You will most likely get authorized for the full 12 months. And it's up to you if you choose to only work for 3 to 4 out of those months. But just keep in mind that in the future, you won't necessarily be able to recuperate the rest of the 12 months that you didn't use. But yes, if you choose to just work for 3 to 4 months and then either you transfer to a new program or you choose to leave the US, that's completely fine, not a problem. We would just say if you're still on OPT and you're leaving the US and ending your status, just to talk to ISSA so that we can make sure that your record is updated correctly. Yes, Andrew, please stick around for questions at the end. I'm happy to answer it. Can I publish a book while on OPT? That's a great question. So if the work that you're doing is related to your major and the book that you're publishing or the work that you're doing to publish the book is related to the major, then technically, yes, you can publish a book while on OPT and you'd be authorized for employment to receive any sort of royalties or any sort of payment that you would get for having published a book. Again, you just want to report the employment and you would want to make sure that the work you're doing, again, related to your major field of study. If I have another offer for another program and my OPT application has been approved, will I get another opportunity for OPT at the end of my second program? It depends on the degree level of the new program that you're moving to, Portia. So if you are a master's student and you apply for OPT and you get approved for OPT at the master's level, and then you apply for, and then your new program is also a master's degree, then no, you would not be able to apply for OPT again if you had already been authorized at the master's level, even if you don't use that OPT that you were previously approved for. If you're moving on to a postmaster's level, like a postmaster's certificate or a PhD, something that is higher than the master's degree, then you would be eligible for another 12 months of OPT based on the new program. Hopefully that answers the question. If someone gets an H-1B approval before May 20th, of the F1 visa, can they wait for a couple of months to get started with work without applying for OPT and without being on an F1 visa? I think before May 20th, I guess it depends on when your H-1B takes effect. Leah, did you want to answer that one?
Yeah, so I said if it's assuming it's with the lottery, it's connected to the lottery. It sounds like with that date it isn't, but then you're just going to because it will be within the grace period, then it will be fine. That start date, he said in a different message, the start date is July 10th. And so it should be fine because that would be within the start date, within the grace period of